which or who are the name, who seems to be the name, which name seems to be appearing the most. And it does, at the moment, picking up from all your texts, tweets and emails, the majority of support would seem to be going towards Rishi Sunak, although he does seem to be quite a Marmite character. This was from Jeff. I put my money on Rishi Sunak. Everyone complaining about it. In fact, he made a video. To me, that shows he's a thinking man, someone who thinks ahead. But then straight underneath the next one to come in is Greg in Harlow. Labour would love Rishi Sunak as the new leader of the Conservative Party. Labour would then walk the next election and win. Richard in Knightsbridge. Sunak's campaign video is beyond vulgar. His MP supporters should ask the local associations before they back him. If Sunak's on the list of two, then as a Tory party member, I would vote for AN other. And that seems to be, at the moment, and it is early days, but it seems to be, Richard, that you might be on the money there, in that it does appear to be, at the moment, very early days, Rishi Sunak versus whoever the other person is. But we will know more, and we will, of course, chart this for you. We will know more when more rules are handed down as to how it is to proceed, the level of support that each of the 11, and it could indeed be 12 by the time the 1920, it could be more, I suppose, the 1922 committee sits. Then they will know exactly how this is all going to play out. And I said earlier that the people, and indeed we've been speaking to the candidates, now have to attract as many heavyweight supporters as they can, people who've held or are indeed currently in cabinet positions, and that leads us neatly to George Eustice, who of course is a Conservative MP and is Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Secretary, so a very prominent Conservative MP, and he's with me now. And I understand it's perhaps one of the outsiders, without in any way wishing to be confrontational, that I understand you're choosing. Who is it? Mr. Eustice, good morning.
Yeah. Yes, I've decided to support Grant Shapps, who only just launched his campaign yesterday. But the reason for that is, for 2 years now, I've sat around the cabinet table with him. I think he's got very good judgment. I've sat through various, COBRA emergency committee meetings on everything to do with preparing for a no-deal Brexit, to keeping the food supply moving through the short straits with problems with ferries and problems with COVID. And I just think he's shown good judgment. He's got a lot of experience. He's been in the cabinet under three different party leaders. He was chairman for a while, and I think he's a good communicator and will be able to campaign. And, a bit like me, in the last couple of years when the going's been tough and things have been difficult, he's often been the one who's called upon to go out and do the morning media round to deal with difficult situations. And I think as a communicator and someone who does the media, he can deal with whatever's thrown his way, and I think that's important.
So what I'm hearing is he's very good, and he's the man you want to field at difficult times. Can he strategise, though? Can he look forward? Is he someone who will be thinking not just of how do we handle tomorrow's press round, as you and I both call it, but how are we going to handle the finances of next year and the year after? Secretary of State.
Yes, he can. So he's said already that he will have an emergency budget, and within the first week of coming in, he's going to establish a star chamber process to work out what we do with the public finances and how we approach these issues like tax and spending. And I think if you just look at what he's done in the Department for Transport, it's for a long time the old franchise model has been, broken down. He's lanced that and come up with a really much improved way of running our railways, where there's private enterprise coming in, but where government performs that commissioning role to make it much more joined up than it had been. And I think that's a big change. And we're shortly going to be launching as a government Great British Railways, which is pulling that together. And I think he's shown his ability to get those big things right too.
How much is there a danger, Mr. Eustice, of some voters perhaps watching this? I don't need to remind you that we are in tough times. There's the cost of living crisis. There is indeed the war in Ukraine. There's all sorts of other issues. And the Conservative Party seem intent on fielding as many candidates as they do, and each of them taking shots at each other. It's not edifying for people outside the circle, is it?
No, of course. And look, I've done this is my fourth leadership campaign. I did two for Michael Gove. I did one for David Cameron way back in the beginning. It's very important that all of the candidates, well, of course, they have to differentiate themselves and explain what their approach would be. We are all colleagues in the same party, and it's going to be incredibly important for people, to whoever wins, to put the party back together, to pull things back together. And therefore, the tone that people adopt in this campaign really matters. And I'm supporting Grant Shapps. I've never been an MP who thinks you should sit on your hands and wait and see which way the wind's blowing before you declare. I think We owe it to people, because we know the candidates. People like me owe it to other party members to get out there from the beginning, state who we think should be the next leader and why. But there are many other good candidates as well, and we're not going to get into the business of criticising or dragging down others, because ultimately we are all in the same party.
What do you imagine the timing will be? I appreciate the committee 1922 meets tonight, but it is suggested that you want to be in a position by July 21st where there are just the two candidates. Is that your understanding of how this will work, Mr. Eustice?
Yes, and obviously the 1922 committee will decide this, but I think it would be very difficult to do it any other way, because MPs just wouldn't be around. It'll be in their constituencies during August. And I think what we want to do is to make sure this is done quite quickly, since we are in government. We don't have the luxury of being in opposition and thinking about things. We've got to get this done quickly. I suspect we will have quite an intense series of voting rounds during the course of this week, and then also next week, with a view to getting to the final two by recess, so by next Wednesday. It's all going to happen in the next 10 days. So I know your listeners will probably be already quite tired of what they would see as a parade of people coming out with all their ideas in a very, very wide field, but I can assure them it'll be whittled down to the final two quite quickly, and then it'll go out to the party membership during August. And I'd expect us to have a new party leader in place, and for the Queen to call on that party leader to form a government sometime in September.
So the early half, I would imagine, is what your party would be striving for, wouldn't it, Mr. Eustice?
I would have thought so, but it's not a conversation I'm close to.
Okay.
The Conservative Party has got a lot of experience of running these. They will want to run a series of hustings in different regions, usually at least six some of those hustings, sometimes more. And they'll want to make sure they've got time to do that during those summer months. But I would have thought, yes, that we'll be seeking to get this wrapped up, certainly before the Conservative Party conference, which is obviously late September.
Indeed. Just coming back to your chosen man before we move on to another issue, Grant Shapps. He is the Minister for Broadcast. He does handle some particularly tricky days. He has enormous experience in the transport field. No real financial service, though, has he? It's not as if he's ever performed particularly high level there. Isn't that a key requirement now?
Well, it's a key requirement on whoever wins this and whoever becomes party leader and prime minister. It's a key requirement for them to put together a cabinet that's got all of the skills and talent and experience that they need. And so, yes, what he will be doing if he becomes leader is appointing a chancellor who has got that depth and that experience. But, let's not underestimate his own record. He had a very successful career in business before he came in to politics. Anybody who's run a big department, and this goes for me, and everybody who's run a Secretary of State as a department, we have to deal with finances in our own department on a weekly basis. So he will actually understand far more than you might think about these matters.
All right. One thing I must bring up in your brief as Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, we have a dairy crisis on the way, I understand. Britain faces a dairy shortage, crippling lack of workers, forces farmers to slash production, reports today's Daily Telegraph. This is coming from Arla Foods, producers of, among others, Cravendale milk and Lurpak butter, also saying prices will surge at the fastest rate in 13 years. Secretary of State, two aspects there, price rises and shortages.
So what we're seeing in many agricultural commodities, and dairy's no exception, is the increase in gas prices had a knock-on impact on fertiliser costs for farmers and feed costs, which are particularly important feature of the cost for a dairy farm. And that is, yes, driving some increases in the farm gate price of milk. We've already seen it rise to about 45 pence. That's nearly double what it was, say, 6 or 7 years ago. And there's some projections it could go a bit higher. So, yes, we are seeing some inflationary pressures because of that increased price of fertiliser. But it's also important to note that in the last 5 years, generally speaking, dairy farms have seen a strong recovery in their incomes, and they're still seeing further price rises this year. So, as a general rule, they've got increased input costs, but they're also getting an increased farm gate price.
But is there a shortage of workers, though, lastly?
Well, like every sector, every sector of the economy is struggling to find
Is this because
staff.
of Brexit?
It's nothing to do with Brexit. So on a dairy farm, they would typically, a typical dairy farm might employ 2 or 3 people, sometimes a bit more, sometimes 4. So it's not huge numbers of staff. And so I can understand, say, a strawberry farm that employs hundreds or sometimes thousands of people. Well, they need access to a seasonal worker scheme.
Right.
When it comes to dairies, it's a very small number of people on an individual farm, but because they're often in remote areas, nevertheless, they do sometimes struggle to get people to fill those posts.
Grateful for your time. Thank you, George Eustice, Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Secretary, appearing here at LBC, where at 8 o'clock the news is next.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation.